My name is Greg Jones, and I'm Dean of Duke Divinity School, and it's a great delight to welcome you to this evening's event. It's a part of our celebration of Duke Initiatives in Theology and the Arts, our 10th anniversary. We look forward to this evening's program with Kate Bowler and Christian Wiman and Lanecia Rouse-Tinsley with great anticipation, talking about important themes at the intersection of theology and the arts around the arts and suffering and God. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce to you the Provost of Duke University, Professor Sally Kornbluth, who's the Chief Academic Officer of the university. She's a cell biologist by background, the James B. Duke Professor of Pharmacology and Cancer Biology. She's been providing extraordinary academic leadership here at Duke University for the last 5 years and is just beginning her 6th year as provost. It's a great delight to be able to work with her as she provides leadership across Duke University for the undergraduate program as well as the various graduate and professional schools. Would you join me in welcoming Professor Sally Kornbluth?
Thanks very much. I really just want to welcome everyone here on behalf of the university. I want to give a special note of thanks for those who traveled to be part of the symposium. Funnily enough, when we first put together these remarks, there was a comment about, hoping that the weather didn't interfere too much, and it turned out to be a spectacularly beautiful day. I have to say that the Duke Initiative in Theology of the Arts has great significance. It's, as Greg said, been at the university over the last 10 years, and it's highly relevant to the general mission and vision of the arts at Duke. Duke has made significant investments in the arts over the past 10 to 12 years, including the opening of the National Art Museum, the Rubenstein Arts Center, and all of this was done with the goal of developing fuller campus-wide engagement with the arts. DITA is a wonderful example of this. The arts are an integral part of teaching around theology and vice versa. I want to give special thanks to the McDonald Agape Foundation for underwriting the DITA 10 Symposium and for their support of various university initiatives over the years, including theology, medicine, and culture. So I'm very, very excited about tonight's program, and I have the great honor of introducing this evening's conversation, or the main moderator of this evening's conversation, Dr. Kate Bowler, who's an associate professor of the history of Christianity in North America at Duke Divinity School. Her first book, Blessed, A History of the American Prosperity Gospel, received widespread media attention and academic praise as the first history of the movement based on divine promises of health, wealth, and happiness. In 2015, Kate was unexpectedly diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at 35. And in her viral New York Times op-ed, she writes about the irony of being an expert in health, wellness, and happiness while being ill. And I have to say, I remember very distinctly opening the Times and reading that op-ed, and I actually didn't know Kate at all at the time. And it was just an amazing piece, and I felt compelled to send her a note, and I'm very grateful to have gotten to know her since then. Her best-selling memoir, Everything Happens for a Reason, and Other Lies I've Loved, tells the story of her struggle to understand the personal and intellectual dimensions of the American belief that all tragedies are tests of character. And again, the book, for those of you, I'm sure many of you have read it, but if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. The publication of Dr. Bowler's memoir has led to appearances on The Today Show, NPR, among many others, and she's given a TED Talk and spoken at major venues like the Aspen Ideas Festival. Her work continues to resonate with readers from all over the world, and she also has a popular podcast, Everything Happens, which has a large following. Dr. Bowler is amazing, as many of you know, and we're very, very fortunate to have her here at Duke and with us this evening hosting this panel. Her work so far has had significant impact at Duke and well beyond Duke, and we look forward to all the more that is to come and to this evening's outstanding panel. So please join me in welcoming Kate to the stage to bring along the panel. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. This is such an exciting time to be here for DITA's 10 years of celebrating the intersection of faith and the arts. And I'm so grateful that you've chosen to join us tonight for this time of discovery. It's one of the great joys of not just interview, but conversation, that we get to find that special magic that only happens when we can come together with open hearts. One of the only reasons I started a podcast was to make friends, but also because I was terrible at not being like, oh, me too, I'd love to talk to you more about that. So this is an invitation for us all to be changed. And also, just because the environment feels a little bit fancy, I also just want to encourage you that this is a time to settle in. You'll watch me openly struggle with my water for about 5 to 10 minutes. And I also misjudged these heels, so there's a strong chance I'm just going to get comfortable and enjoy our time for you to meet two people that I am really thrilled are here with us. It's also a time, if something comes to mind, you think about a question, we'll be doing question and answer at the end, so just feel free to jot a little note and know that we're really excited to welcome you into this conversation where we can be ourselves together. I hope, can I talk about you in the third person for a moment?
Please.
Do you mind? Okay, great, super, all right then. Lanecia Rouse-Tinsley is an abstract artist based in Houston, Texas, whose work includes photography, painting, teaching, writing, and speaking. And she got her Master's of Divinity here at Duke Divinity School, and also served local churches in South Carolina and England and Tennessee before becoming the owner and creator of LAR Art Studio. And Christian Wiman is a poet, an essayist, and author, and translator of over 10 books, including his completely gorgeous memoirs you must all read, My Bright Abyss, and his latest, He Held Radical Light, which I don't recommend you reading in public unless you are comfortable with public crying. He served as the editor of Poetry Magazine for 10 years, and his work has been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times Book Review, The Atlantic Monthly, among many others. He is also a professor at my alma mater, Yale Divinity School, where he also, this is just to put in a plug for having a family of nerds, but as a mentor to my younger sister, Maria, which has inspired her turn toward poetry. So when I look at him, I see the reason why I'm listening to a lot of poetry at the dinner table lately. But when I see you, I see two unbelievable martyrs for theological education. So I'm so grateful that you're here with us. And for your willingness to do two things, I think, at the same time. The work that art demands, which is that we somehow turn ourselves inside out. And also the work that Christ demands, which is that we somehow render visible God's work in the world. So I'm grateful for some reason that you do it on purpose, which seems almost impossible, and that we can talk about some of those great feats tonight. So if you don't mind, I thought maybe we could start about talking about faith and creativity. I think you both have professions that people wouldn't naturally assume are also ministry. So Lanecia, you're a trained pastor, and I think a lot of people, maybe some students in the crowd tonight, might assume that there's kind of a narrow track that ministry assumes. So what was the first moment when you realized that art could also be ministry?
I think I realized that when I was like 5 years old.
Really?
Yes. Well, the funny story is my dad's a pastor, and my mom's an artist, and she's a dancer. And when we lived in Dillon, South Carolina, she realized that she wanted to teach dance, and that there were not a lot of affordable dance classes for African American children who are part of our church and our community. And so my dad was like, well, we have a fellowship hall basement that is not being used. You have the talents and the gifts, so let's make this a ministry of the church, and you teach modern dance and jazz. And a program grew from that in that space. And so my parents really modeled for me in ministry how creativity and the arts could be a part of the kingdom work that we do. And so I continued to use music, especially, and photography in my ministry work. And it wasn't until 2014, when life shifted for me in a major way, that I then leaped full-time into art and not ministry full-time.
Yeah. And Chris, what was your first big rapturous moment. You were raised, as I recall, as a Southern Baptist in West Texas, and then you took a break from Jesus, if that's a normal thing to say. And then, so I'm curious, what was your first sort of intersection, big moment for poetry as also theology or ministry?
Well, it's interesting the way you framed it.
You ruined it.
But you said that you thanked us for doing it deliberately, or I can't remember exactly how you put it, but in fact, I've tried to walk away from poetry many times in my life, in the same way that I've tried to walk away from God, and wish that they would just leave me alone. There's a great quote from W.B. Yeats where he says, if this beautiful woman, Maud Gunn, who was a political activist, had just been willing to walk away from her politics and fall in love with him, I might have thrown poor words away and been content to live. And I've always felt that. But those two things, the making of art and the worshiping of God, the pursuit of God, God's pursuit of us, are, to me, raveled up together. But my first experience, interestingly, I grew up in a house without books, but I was going to the First Baptist Church of Dallas when I was would have been second grade, something like that. And at the time, maybe it still is, it was the largest Baptist church in the world, which is huge, enormous. It was a guy named W.A. Criswell was the minister, and so they had that altar call, and I had written a poem, and instead of going down to get saved, I went down. I don't even know how I knew what a poem was or anything, but I went down and I gave it to Brother Criswell, as we called him, and he published it. You can verify this.
Stop it.
He published it in that Baptist, I think it's called the Baptist Standard, the newsletter.
Yeah.
It's like my biggest publication ever. But the poem was, I love the Lord and he loves me. I will not forget and neither will he. Yeah. It's all downhill.
I play the cello, and when I was little, I had this dream that I would be the very first singing cellist, just a very powerful profession, and just so much dignity. And except whenever I went out to play, I found that unbidden, I would just start explaining my piece to people. And I was like, no, you don't understand. There's this really interesting thing in the middle. Which is what led me away from music and just more toward talking. But I think I realized that there are some fields that allow for the mystery of interpretation and there to be more space than I was perhaps willing to allow. So I wondered, Lanecia, if you could talk a bit about abstract art, which by nature leaves room for mystery, and how have you thought about the role of mystery in your art?
So I think I was drawn to abstraction because of the space that it allowed for the mystery and the uncertainty, for contemplation, for the opportunity to really just sit and be, and for me, to express what was within me, the things that were not necessarily visible and that could be certain. I was drawn to the exploration of how texture and color and shape could lead us to places of wonder. So abstraction for me has been this really liberating space, coming from a profession where words were so important in pastoring and preaching and teaching. And when I was confronted with death, in a real way, and had to sit in this place of unknowing and really grappling and reckoning with life and death as it rested. My child rested on my chest, and I guess we can talk about that story later. It led me to wanting to explore spaces that were not so confined and concrete, but left room to open us up to things.
How long a time was that after your child died and you turn towards abstraction like that?
Yeah, so it was during my grieving process that I began to look for spaces like Herman Park, a park in the city. I spent a lot of time there. But I also spent an equal amount of time at the Rothko Chapel, at the Tomley Gallery in Houston, and the Manel. And I was drawn especially to the abstract expressionist work. And I would sit with Rothko for a while and just sit in that because it made room and space for me to be in my sorrow and my suffering. Yeah, and then I would walk over to Tomley's gallery that was like this big, massive piece of color and possibility and hope and sit there and weep, but knowing that I longed to get to that place as well. And so there was like this reminder that joy is possible. So abstraction just was a place of ministry, I guess, to me, and seemed to be a place that opened me up and allowed me to deconstruct my faith in ways and deal with the questions that were just really too deep for words. I couldn't find the words.
Yeah, that's right.
But color and texture and shape helped me articulate a new language. And so that's where I've landed with abstraction. Yeah. That's what led me there. So it was shortly after, maybe like 2 months after that during my sabbatical time, where I made my way outside of my apartment to these spaces.
Well, I mean, it feels sometimes to me when I'm talking about things like this that like grief is a thing we like invite in. There's so few spaces in our lives where we get permission to say the thing, and that in our lives that there were befores and afters. And it sounds from your story and in your art that there is a distinct before and after that grief has played a significant part in. I'd love to.
Yeah, there was definitely. I would have never really considered myself an artist prior to 2013. I would say I love to sing. I take some photos. I long to be an artist, but I was a kid who got her first C in the 7th grade in art class. And as someone who felt she needed to excel in everything, and I challenged Mr. Marshall really hard on this grade. And it was almost like the Charlie Brown teacher moment. He was saying something, but all I heard was like, you don't have talent here, right? And so I was like, oh, if I can't do that well, then I'll focus in the areas that I do. But I was always really curious about the arts, and especially the visual arts, but I didn't see that as being my language, my place. And so I would sing and do music and then work art and creativity into the work that I was doing. Loved theater and shit. Like I just loved the arts and the places that it would take me to, and stories that would draw me into, and the ways that it opened me up that other things just didn't do in my life. But when AJ is her name, she was not quite 5 months when my cervix, this is an awful name, and I know there are a lot of smart people out there, so maybe some of you can help the medical field come up with a new one. But they said it was an incompetent cervix.
Oh, stop.
So right?
Okay.
Telling a woman, and the trauma of all of that, incompetent cervix. But basically my cervix was just too weak to hold her any longer, and just no history. So the doctors didn't know. So within 22, 24 hours, I was in labor, giving birth to my child who was it wasn't time, you know? So when that moment came for me, and because of the ministry that my dad had lived and that I had lived, I had come face to face, right, with suffering in a real way. I wasn't far into that. But this death of a creation, a part of myself too, dying in that moment, it broke me in ways that nothing had ever broken me before, right? And then my response in the healing, and it may have something to do with the fact that while at that time I was in a profession where I was managing an art project with men and women who were living on the streets, right? It was a therapeutic art project and an economic empowerment. So I had seen how art had helped people deal with real trauma, right? So I had that in my toolbox in this moment. It may have been the fact that in some ways I wanted to resist this idea that my body could not create, right? And I wanted words. I wanted to live, right? I wanted to live, and so I wanted to choose a way of living with this new reality, this pain, going through the grief in a way that was honest, in a way that honored life, in a way that I no longer had to put on the PK smile, the preacher's kid smile, and say, I'm good, because I was broken, right? This vulnerability. And I found that in art. And I found that in paint. And so in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep, I'd find myself on the floor with watercolor. And I just wanted color, you know? And I would weep, and I would read things, and I'd listen to jazz, and I would feel all of the feels. But I would paint. I just wanted to paint. I didn't want to sing. I didn't want to speak. I just wanted to play with color. And so I did. And I started leaning in. I just kept leaning in and realizing that as I lived into the words we often use as new normal, but I like examine, the prayer of examine, like what drains you? And then what gives you life? Every day I was just kind of sitting with that. And it's like, you know, I want to get a studio downtown because I really love making art. I love painting. And I'm going to get this studio. And I just started taking steps towards it. Yeah. And I started studying and painting. And I landed in the studio playing with color and texture and form on a daily basis and creating art that is abstract in nature. And that feels like the clothes I was always meant to wear. Yeah.
It's amazing to me, your language of like breaking and breaking open, and the way you just allowed it to bring in not just death and fear, but also beauty. It's an incredible act of bravery and also protest to the darkness.
You know, I'm reading a book by Alice Walker called Hard Times Requires Furious Dancing. And it's a poetry book. I mean, not many people know she's a poet as well. And in the foreword, Shiloh McLeod writes that her work helps to give the reader courage to reach into their own suffering and name that, but then also to dig deeper and find the beauty even within it. And I think I just had this lineage of artists that had been a part of my life. Miles Davis, John Coltrane, James Baldwin, you know, Toni Morrison, Sam Gilliam, all of these artists who had been a part of, who had shown me the possibility of things, right? Of journeying through, and on top of my faith. And that faithful witness,
and
right?
also Jesus.
People, and Jesus,
and also
right?
the word of the Lord.
And then
Yeah,
all
totally.
of the people who had been a part of my story,
Yeah.
you know? And so in that moment, that helped me to get the courage to do the same.
Yeah. Wow. Chris, you also have a lot of strong feelings about mystery. You have such beautiful language for the way that the indirectness of our ability to name, like you were just saying, the kind of sideways way you sometimes have to get at the things you can't fully express, that have led you to language about God as your bright and sometimes dark abyss. I was wondering if you could tell us more about the way that you've given a lot of space for mystery as also the place of discovery.
Yeah, I was thinking about a couple things when you were talking. One was, I'd read this book recently by Michel Henry, this philosopher, about Vasily Kandinsky. And it's called Seeing the Invisible. And he says, I'll come back to your question in a way, but...
No, I like a Kandinsky reference.
Okay.
Let's do it.
But his argument is that, and I think this was Kandinsky's as well, that that abstraction is not a deviation from the natural course of painting. It's the fruition of what painters have been trying to do for years, which is to see the invisible. And that they found it's a whole new language being expressed. And as you were talking, I was thinking, there are different kinds of abstraction. Sometimes in poetry, abstraction can be very irritating because it erases reality. And I expect that's probably true in painting as well. But then there's another kind of abstraction that just releases it. And I think that's what, I mean, certainly with Kandinsky. For me, another artist is Lee Bonteque, whose work I just adore, and had really a rapturous experience once when they had a whole retrospective of her work in Chicago. And my wife and I had just gotten to know each other. It was like a date. We went on an afternoon walk, and I don't know if you know her work, but the beginning is this militaristic stuff, this big sculptures, and they all have a hole in it, and they're deliberately, abrasively ugly, and wounded. And then she goes through a period of whimsy, which I don't think is very successful, but eventually she dropped completely out of the art world and went and made her work for 30 years in a barn in Pennsylvania. And then she made these things that also had they're like mobiles that hang from the ceiling. They're incredibly abstract and incredibly complicated, and yet they all have this hole in them. And it's as if she's lifted the souls out of those earlier pieces. And it's probably, I mean, I am not a crying person, but I cried at that. It's probably one of the few times with art that I've actually been brought to tears. But it was that, and it was, I don't think Lee Bonteque would consider herself, this is the mystery part, would consider herself a religious person. But the experience that I was having, and my wife was then, not my wife then, but now wife, was having at the time was very much a religious experience. And so I'm fascinated by that kind of mystery that can exist and be released by people who don't themselves believe. But it seems to me as much God as God that I find anywhere else.
The fact that in the Hermitage, the entire Kandinsky floor is unair conditioned might also make you weep, because I felt that way. I was like, guys, you might want to keep this stuff for later. I noticed that, I was only kind of built for historical writing, which was a lot of like, in 1725, but on a Thursday. I struggled to, I was diagnosed very suddenly, and the second I got sick, I immediately found myself to be much more responsive to cultural scripts that I didn't know existed, about being unbelievably cheerful about my illness. I was just going to be the happiest stage 4 cancer patient that ever walked the halls of Duke University Hospital. And part of my own discovery of what creativity and art could do was just that I found myself unable to say things directly. I used to be so good, I thought, at expressing myself, and then I found myself entirely empty of things that felt honest anymore. And so I found a place I could go. The Collegeville has that mid-century modern sort of paradise in the middle of a cornfield in Minnesota, where there's an outdoor xylophone band camp playing at all times, apparently. And I thought I'd just give myself 10 days to write all of my terrible feelings. But it was creative writing that let me sort of know that something was true, and then just try to break through all of the words until I got to it. And then you can tell, right? Like there's this weird moment of release in a way that the impossible thing is somehow there in front of you that you didn't know if you could get to, in a way that I'd never experienced before. And it felt like I was able to be honest for the first time, maybe. Honest in a way that other ways of being myself it didn't feel accessible anymore. And
there's a great moment in that. You mentioned James Baldwin. There's an incredible, my favorite short story in the world is Sonny's Blues. And the main character, Sonny, has just come up. He's listening to a gospel singer on the corner, and his brother's watching him from up here. And Sonny has been a heroin addict and is now out of prison. And he comes up, but he's a great jazz pianist. I mean, like a true master of genius. And and he comes upstairs and he said, I was just thinking, you know, how much suffering that woman must have experienced to be able to sing like that. It's repulsive to think how much suffering she had to experience. And I think it's both those things together.
Yeah.
Yes, the suffering can open you up, but yes, it's repulsive.
Yes,
It is.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. For people who might not know, Chris, about the way that grief has woven its way into your life in art, I wondered if you could share a bit about what led you to maybe the prompting for what created My Bright Abyss and where your story has taken you.
Yeah, well, I was diagnosed with cancer when I was, hadn't been married for a year. And it was really bad, and my prognosis was bad. And it was a shocking time because I had just begun being able to try to pray. So it wasn't grief that led me to that, it was actually joy. I find that two things, it's usually either destitution or abundance that lead people back to God if they've been away. And people think that it's always destitution. That's not true. I've known lots of people that it was abundance, and I would say that of myself. But when that happened, my whole life was just ripped open. And I'd finally fallen in love, really for the first time in my life. And suddenly at the end, after 9 months, it looked like it was going to be over. And so I began that book. I was unable to write poems, and I was down in Texas and for a month and just began scrawling out thoughts, and really as a way of staying sane, staying alive. I had no thought of writing a book. I had no thought of anything, really. I was just writing in my journal, honestly. And then it just became a way of my mind making sense of things and holding on to things and translating this grief into daily existence. But that book, it took 7 years to write. It's tiny, but it took me 7 years to write it. So it was, woven in and out at various times. And we're a culture that evades suffering, and I was part of that culture very much. We don't want it. We don't. And when we suffer, we move away from it as fast as we can and get back on the treadmill and just put it behind us. But I'm with Nietzsche, who said that the whole purpose of life is to find meaning in suffering, or you are screwed, because you're gonna suffer, man. I mean, you're gonna suffer. And I think as a culture, it's obscene, the kind of the lack that we have for dealing with it.
Do you find that your experience of grief created a kind of urgency in you to make, just like whether it's beauty or protest or like anything to stave off fear? Like what did it sort of like set a clock in a certain way for you to try to pull something out of you?
Is this you?
Either of you, my friends.
Oh.
I'm going to just take all my 40 pounds of hair away from this microphone.
I think yes. And in many ways, the death of AJ and my journey through it kind of liberated me from fear. Because I think fear had been the thing that had hindered me from being the artist that I was to be. The making, however, I love how you use like the sanity. And because I refused to ignore the pain. I refused to not feel. And I just knew that vulnerability, community, honesty was going to be the thing to help me get through, right? And so my process of making was this way of getting it out. And part of it was like just getting it out. I didn't really care who saw it. I just had to get it out. And I needed it for, to keep me sane,
Yeah.
to live with it. And and there was a part of it too, Kate, that I realized I didn't want to survive life too, because I'd always had like periodic depression before.
Yeah.
But I wanted to not just survive it, I wanted to thrive.
Yeah.
I had this new, I could see life differently and appreciation, and even fight to love the places that I don't really always love. But it was just, I longed to see and to express what I was feeling and seeing. And it happened to be in paid form, an expression, and to sit with the uncertainty of things. And the creative process is also so important for me as an artist. And my process is one of always of following curiosity and discovery and acceptance of seemingly mistakes, working with them, adjusting to what happens on the canvas. And I never start off knowing what the end will be, result. There's always room for a release of that control and holding everything on the canvas loosely. And then through the process of making, it's also formed and shaped my life and how I live. I feel like it's made me a better human, more honest human in so many ways, better partner, all of these things in life. And so I just had to make. I had to be.
I wish honesty, vulnerability, and community were like the taglines for life. You're just like, you must accept all these three things to live. Because I think that's right. It leads you to this bizarre, horrifying interdependence where like individuality is just no longer an option.
I have this funny story of when I was commissioned by a church to do 9 pyramid paintings, and they were 6 feet by 6 feet, and that's 70, like big canvases. And the largest canvas I think I'd painted on was like maybe a 36 by 36 or something. So I went back to the art store to get some things, and this was like a month later. And the manager said, "Lanecia, how are those big paintings coming?" I was like, "Oh, they're the masterpieces of minimalism, you know." We had this great laugh, and then he said, "Lanecia, paint big." And I was like, paint big. And he's like, "Yeah, get big brushes, paint big." He talked about some painting techniques. And then he looked at me and said, "And just remember that the canvas is strong enough to hold all of your truth and all of your energy. So just let it out." And those words are written in my studio. And I wish as a child growing up in the church, I'd been told that about God.
That God is big enough to, that just mean?
Just hold all of it, all of me. That this creative, loving energy force that is in this world is big enough, strong enough, small enough, grace-filled enough. Maybe that's the word, like this grace to hold all of me, right? The pain, all of it, and my honesty in the pain. And this, because it's repulsive.
Yeah.
There's a lot of suffering that exists that just does not need to be. Doesn't have to be,
I did kind of have a question about the medium that you both work in and whether you feel, it sounds like it's an answer to what I was wondering about, whether the medium offers a wide enough range for the range of sort of theological, artistic, in every way, curiosity. Because sometimes I find I can't write when I realize that what I want to say is uglier than I wish it was. But that certain truths don't feel, I just don't naturally want to write them because it doesn't always feel big enough for me. And I'm just wondering if poetry and abstract art feel large enough for all the expression of the sort of range of experience that suffering and grief brings out in who we are.
Well, I run into the limits of my own talent all the time with poetry, but I think it's, but certainly it's capacious enough to include everything. I don't find that personally with prose. I probably get more praise for prose, but I don't. But it's poetry that with the the sonic release of it and the formal energy of it, which is an abstract energy, is what I find most moving and most inclusive, and most able to contain the fusion of praise and rage that I feel half the time. Those two things at the same time. Not one and then the other, but fused, like Job or something. Same thing.
Because people always use very different metaphors for like this relationship between, in this case, like grief and art or faith and art, and sometimes there's like a bridge, or it's an exploration, or it's a reflection. And it made me wonder, do you ever find that your art is ever an answer? Does it ever answer a question that grief posed?
You want me to go?
Here you go.
Very much. I've definitely gotten answers out of my art. It is a miraculous, mysterious endeavor to me, and which is one of the reasons why it confuses me when I see transfiguring, revelatory experience in artists who have no faith whatsoever and would define themselves maybe as atheists or whatever. I just don't understand what they do with that experience afterwards. Like, you've had this experience, and then afterwards you're like, all right, well, now what? Go make a ham sandwich.
Yeah.
But it seems like it seems that there's some way of translating that experience into life, in the same way that there's a way of translating faith into belief, or faith into religious experience. But I've been shown direct things in poems that have appalled me. Some have rescued me, some have just appalled me.
Yeah.
And they seem to me messages that I had to hear and act on. Definitely. I think it's dangerous art, poetry. And probably all art is dangerous, but I think there are real dangers there.
Yeah. Well, now I want to know what it is. Like, so much. What was the worst one? You don't have to tell
I
me.
almost said something and
I'm like,
I stopped myself.
let's dig deep. Yeah. Would you pick a different model? Would you pick like it's an exploration, it's an expression, did it ever just like give you an answer?
It's all of what you just named, and there are moments when there are revelations, I think. Yeah. Not necessarily. Yeah, I mean, I think things are revealed when I pay attention to the process.
Yeah.
That's what I say.
Yeah.
It comes more to me in the process of making,
That makes sense.
and my studies that formed, like wabi-sabi, and just these things that help me kind of grapple with the impermanence of things, and really pushing me to lean into and honor the beauty of the temple. Yeah, and so I find it's that place where I can really, in my studio, I don't have to chuck any of myself out of the door.
Yeah.
I'm free to be stupid sometimes and be brilliant in my own mind. You know, like, it's just this safe space. And in that safety, then I am led. But I do brush up against the limits of my own skills. But yeah, it is a place of discovery for me.
So if I were an art director or a poetry anthologist, and you were going to point to one poem or piece that most expressed your understanding of suffering, what would you point to?
Book of Job.
Did you write that?
Yeah,
I
you
was
asked
so,
me for
yeah.
me.
Yeah, I didn't know you wrote that. That's amazing.
It is amazing.
Good
It's
talk.
an excellent piece of writing. Yes.
I guess I was more
Oh, so you
thinking
mean more,
of like
you mean
one
like
of
my
yours.
poem?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to do that. But I would tell you lots of poems by other people. Like,
You're such a sneaky question
Yeah.
answerer.
I have one, actually. I have the exemplary poem that gives an idea of my idea of suffering and how one lives in relation to it. But it's by another poet. I don't want to do, that freaks me out to think of like picking one of my own. But
You're like, it's actually on the screen behind you. Turn around. We'll all read it out loud.
But the Polish poet Anna Kamińska, she's part of that great generation of Polish poets in the mid-20th century, but she's kind of the forgotten one. She's not really known here at all, but soon her diaries will be published, and she's known in Poland for her diaries. She converted to Catholicism after the death of her husband, actually, in her 40s. And they were very much in love, and, well, that's an example of destitution. And she began keeping these diaries at that time, and they're fantastic, and Yale is going to publish them in English relatively soon. But she wrote, there's one poem that she wrote which is called A Prayer That Will Be Answered. I think I can do it. I may mess it up, so I'm not, if I mess up, I'm just going to start.
Very good.
It's short. It's a short little poem. So think about what you pray for, a prayer that will be answered. Lord, let me suffer much and then die. That's how it begins. Lord, let me suffer much and then die. Let me walk through silence and leave nothing behind, not even fear. Make the world continue. Let the ocean kiss the sand just as before. Let the grass stay green so that frogs can hide in it, so that someone can bury his face in it and sob out his love. Make the world continue just as before. Make the day rise brightly as if there were no more pain. And let my poem stand clear as a window pane bumped by a bumblebee's head. And let my poem stand clear as a window pane bumped by a bumblebee's head. What I love about that is that it's an appeal, to say, Lord, let me suffer and then die. Well, you're going to get that. That's a prayer that's going to, a prayer that will be answered, indeed. And it's a prayer for herself to let reality continue, to let her will align itself with the way things are. And rather than trying to change it, rather than petitioning God for this or this or this. Let me be equal to reality and vanish within it. But let my poem stand clear as a window pane, bumped by a bumblebee's head. Now that's a real prayer. Now that's like asking for something to continue. And the miracle of that poem is that, well, she's dead, and she suffered and she died, and she got all that. The next day was, went on, nobody noticed. And yet, here we are bumping our heads against this poem that's as clear as a window pane, as if this prayer has truly been answered. And so it's that mystery for me that I would say that poem is for me a real, something I return to again and again.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, it's hard for me to name a number of paintings from other people because there's a lot of work that I encounter that.
I bet one of yours.
Okay.
I want it. I want it all.
Yeah. I think in some ways it's still waiting to be made. And still at work in progress. However, in December of this past year, it marked 5 years. And since AJ's death, and the grief for me, just even the months before, was so strong. It was almost as if, because grief comes in cycles, as we know, but it felt really intense, like the first year. And so I realized in that I had not explored in my work directly that part of me, my story, that grief, and that I had done what I needed to do to accept and to move through it. But I decided to begin to explore through my art that pain and that grief. And so a body of work was created, and it's still, like I said, a process. But one painting in particular, I would say, is from that collection is With and Out. And it's that collection of paintings I painted with the elements. So outside a lot, I would leave canvases outside. If it rained overnight, it rained. Just wanting to explore this idea of praying almost to like dealing with uncertainty and release of control is a lot of what I felt during that. All of them were like raw canvases that I then stretched. You know, it was like the first time I played with that and dirt and making my own pigments and playing with the rain. And then I also leaned into rust dyeing and playing with indigo and cyanotype. And I ended up creating a piece using photography that I took as part of my healing that first year. And then other moments in the space between. And created this quilt-like piece of fabric cyanotype. And it's actually here at the part of the exhibition.
Cool.
Yeah, and so it's, yes, you can see what I'm talking to and referring about. But that piece and Within, Without, I think, kind of taps into, in many ways, that grief for me.
You've reflected both so much that gets the questions, the big questions of why, I think. The why we keep pouring ourselves into the world and why we hope in the way that we do when we know that everything is inherently fragile. I think I've struggled to know exactly what that looks like when we've had moments where it's just no longer true that like God never gives us more than we can handle. Like we've had the experience of being beyond, right? And then past limitation, and then what's beyond that? And then how do we get back to a place of purpose and agency is never the right word again, but of just the deep call of hope. Because I think we're always trying to run the math, right, of how we live with beauty once that clock has sort of been set, in which you know that you want to make life rich and beautiful and that there's a call to do that. Otherwise, you'll just, the choice is the choice. And I wondered, Chris, there's a passage you wrote in that first memoir that I thought would so perfectly express the way that we run the math on what to love. I know I've struggled, I've struggled a lot with like how you run the math when you're not sure like what actions count, like what's the gift, right? And sometimes the gift seems obvious, like you married someone and you know you should love them really well. And then sometimes the gift seems like weird. Right after I got sick, I had to decide if I was going to write a book that would get me tenure. And I thought, like, well, what if I never live enough to get tenure? Then wouldn't that be a really weird choice to just really work on footnotes in the chemo chair for that long? Is that an excellent use of my time? And then the great choice is, like, how do we evaluate our deepest loves? And Chris, you wrote this beautiful bit about how when you look at your daughters, you experience that love. And I wondered if I could embarrass you by forcing you to read your own prose out loud. And now that I know that you love that so much, I'm definitely going to keep that in mind for next time.
Okay, so this is, I guess my kids must have been just over 1. I had a bone marrow transplant when they turned 1. You can imagine what that was like for my wife. We had twins, and then her husband has a bone marrow transplant. The bone marrow transplant is not fun. I would not recommend that if you're looking for some experience. Right about. This was after that. Though people never say it, you can see it in their eyes sometimes, the question, how could you do it? How could you bring children into a situation so precarious? How could you seed them with this grief? And of course we ask ourselves these questions, my wife and I, when things are bad with me or difficult at home. But then we see them offering each other flowers they've picked from the backyard, or stopping amid their madcap play to kiss each other. Or when we walk into their nursery in the mornings, throwing back their heads and laughing like little palpable fruitions of the love that first led us out of ourselves and to each other. We see these things and we ask, how could we not have had them? How could they not be? How could such life, such love, ever have remained latent and dormant within us?
Chris, it feels like that's the best argument I've ever read for beauty that starves out fear, love that begets more love. That seems like a very loaves and fishes kind of love.
There's an interesting poem by Sharon Olds in the current New Yorker. I just read it on the plane over, and I was actually irritated all the way through. I was thinking, this is not very good. I was irritated. But then at the end, she makes this turn that is just, it's wonderful. And I can't quote it because I just read it, but so it's a blasphemy to paraphrase a poem. But anyway, it's what she says is she's talking about she desired life before she was even born, and her desire for life was her father's desire and her mother's beauty and her mother's money even, and all these things that caused her to come into being. It's really a kind of praise of necessity. And then she says, there is no meaning to any of this. Love is not the meaning. And then she stops and she says, well, love was the means, perhaps. It was the means. And it's a little turn at the end that suddenly it just jolts you a bit. And I think that's similar to what you're saying. Love is the mean. Love is not the meaning. There may be no meaning.
Yeah.
Insofar as we're able to say what it is, to articulate it. But love is the means is close to saying that God may not be a noun, but a verb. It can be better to think of God as a verb rather than a noun. And, I find that useful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. When I hear the way you think about your life in this canvas way, it's such a generous way of thinking about love that begets more that makes more. It sounds like art broke you open in a way that now we all get to see.
Yeah, we do. And there's a connection that happens with others too, in ways that reminds me, it's not always in the encounter where there's a person who really connects and gets it in a way that makes them pause, but in those moments when I'm able to see that, like in open studios or if I'm showing in a space, it reminds me that I'm not alone.
Yeah.
Too, and there's some strength and courage to continue waking up every day and creating in the face of all of the unknowns, right? And I'm more attuned to that after, and I still wake up and I choose to live and choose to make and still choose to believe that we can create beauty and possibility, right? In the face of all of the things, you know. I refuse to turn an eye to the newspaper, to the tears of my friends as we sit and have coffee. You know, like all of that stuff I bring with me into the studio. I bring to the canvas with it. But I also just believe, and our process has taught me that it's possible for us to also create and recreate things in this world. And every day I just try to add my bit to that, and join others who do it, you know. And kind of going back to your question too about my medium, right? And any given day I could be working with fabric, or I could be painting with a canvas or collaging. But I'm also grateful to be a part of a community of artists in various mediums who in many ways are collective voices and individual voices, but collectively speak and provide answers sometimes to questions that maybe in my process and in my medium I'm not able to find, but encountering this dance, you know, it awakens and sparks me to a new reality and a way of seeing the world and seeing myself in this world, and love in the divine in ways that,
what did you say? Honesty, vulnerability, community. I love that you landed on community. We're going to turn to a time of question and answer, and we have microphones up here. And while you are summoning up the courage to be awkward in public, which none of you would be, but I invite you to try, while you are rustling up all of that courage and coming on down, I will ask one question for the interim. So I invite you to come on down. while they are coming, right now, I can feel it.
That's a lot to ask. A lot to ask. People are going to
Deep
walk
inside.
down.
I know, it's very altar call, isn't it? Yeah. I've got a saving plan for each of your lives. I'd like to tell you all about it. So while people are coming on down, when you are looking for inspiration, what are some of the wells that fill you up? Obviously, angry airplane poetry reading is a big source of inspiration for you.
No, I'm praising that.
Oh,
Paul.
sorry,
I'm
that was
praising that. Well, I'm definitely discovering new forms of art. I would say that's probably most what provokes me in writing. But I don't discover that much. I mean, I read constantly, and I would say 90% of what I read I don't like. I'm just constant.
Oh my gosh, you belong at my family dinner table. It's so great. It's such a grouchy place. I love it. All right, who is our first victim? Did we decide? We got stressed out and sat down. Oh, hi. Hello.
I'm Tracy, and I just want to say thank you for sharing yourselves in the way that you are tonight. It's inspirational and it's great. And Kate, I just want to thank you for being my fellow Canadian in North Carolina. Thank you. And nice to have some homeland spirit here. It seems that so often the most beautiful things that are created are not created with the intention of beauty, but of being compelled to put out that which we can no longer hold in. I know as a writer, it is for me, for sure. And in that way, I think it can become sort of co-creating with God. And I'm wondering if you think it becomes redemption in that process, if it's a form of a nugget of God's redemption in our lives when we co-create with Him in a way of getting out that which we can no longer just hold within ourselves.
Oh, lovely question. Thank you. Are you co-creators with God? I hope the answer is yes. Yeah. Usually, Chris will be like, no, for sure not.
Well, you know, look, I'm not as cynical as I may seem, but there's a great quote from Franz Kafka where he has been up all night working, and he's elated, and he writes his lover a letter, these beautiful letters that he wrote, and he says, I have finally realized what writing is. It is the reward for serving the devil. There you go. Very, very great writer. Very, very great writer. But the point is, I mean, he was serious, I think. I think he thought that there was a bit of a diabolical inspiration, or that the diabolical element was that he was missing life for the sake of art. Mm-hmm. And I think that I felt that for years. And so I think that the notion that all creation is redemptive seems to me wrong. Some of it is not. Some really great art is diabolical. Mm-hmm. And for me, working out that tension between when am I not serving God and when am I serving God in art has been a great strain and battle that I don't feel I've resolved. But I do want to say yes, for a lot of art, it's certainly repairing the world, rescuing the world, salvaging reality is how the art critic John Berger says of the work of Cézanne, that it salvages reality for us. But then there's some that maybe not.
And one of your more inspirational phrases about it is your quoting of Jürgen Moltmann's that all theology has to be done within earshot of the dying Christ.
Yeah.
And you write poetry in hopes of being within earshot. That sounds like you?
Yeah, well, that sounds
that
like
was
Jürgen
you.
Moltmann.
That was you.
Yeah.
That was both of you.
That Jürgen Moltmann, his book, The Crucified God, is, for me, one of the great books that I've read. And it came to me at a time, books enter your lives sometime. Marilyn Robinson was like that for me. Fanny Howe was like that for me. They enter your lives at a certain time when they just rescue you. And that book really rescued me. I really felt And I still love it. I taught part of it this past semester. I still think it's a wonderful book. Anyway, I can say that at Duke Divinity School. Everybody
Yeah.
knows.
We're into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to understand your question, because I don't see it as a way of, I'm not sure if that's the question you're asking. The language of redemption for me, of redeeming in relation to my art and practice and my particular story is
Yeah.
really hard for me.
Yeah, that's right.
Because there are certain things that I just,
We don't believe in redeeming suffering, I'm guessing?
Yeah,
I
no.
think we don't. I love it. And then,
no,
yeah,
I'm
but,
not there.
but that the,
Yeah, I will say that the art making process and being an artist, which goes into question about my inspiration, has made me more attuned to the life around me in ways that has, that draws me deeper into like the relationship of love and mystery, like all of these things that kind of give me life, and that help me to live in the space of both joy and sorrow and not drown and break. And to really taste what is good, right? And then to name what is horrid in life. And art has been that medium and that space that has allowed me to do that in ways that I hadn't before, honestly. But now I don't believe in redeeming suffering.
yeah, no, totally.
Redemptive
We're on the
suffering.
team. We're on the team. I like that team.
Okay.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, next. Hello.
This might be a very quick answer, but I'd love to hear you elaborate about why agency is never the right word again
Oh, yeah.
in the context of suffering.
Yeah, right. Agency. Well, I guess I am deeply skeptical of these American mythologies of around suffering people, where they are down but never out. It's always the sort of launching moment, and I found that we sort of have overlapping like theological anthropologies that correspond with that, especially most of the sort of religious scripts provided to us by American evangelicalism, in which all the language is choosing language. So like we choose God, we choose to be in right relationship, and all the agency language. The problem with that, when you are laid low, when you are emptied of everything, including like your ability to recognize your own body, that most of the agency language becomes so deeply punitive to people who suffer that if you're not getting up, then you are, if you're not a winner, you're a loser. And so I do want there to be a kind of, I was having this debate with someone who runs this amazing maternal health organization in Mali, and he just goes around trying to convince everyone that they do have agency, so we can solve stuff like world hunger, which is possible. And he's like, no, Kate, I don't want you to take agency away from people, because I need people to give money to me so we can solve these problems. And I was like, totally, I get that. I'm not trying to be a jerk. But I do hope that we could have two sort of sliding scales, like one of durability in the world, that if you happen to be in a brief moment of durability, that you are between fragilities and that you have resources to give, that agency is an appropriate framework for you. But for the rest of us, that it's a knife that cuts so deeply into our own kind of theological anthropologies, and that so often it's just a language to punish the suffering. Short answer. Yeah.
So I wanted to sing dee, 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 Jesus is calling for the altar call.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Welcome.
But that's not why I'm down
Welcome.
here. I do kind of feel like you walking up to Brother what's his name and handing him your poem. Because my question is like, I'm a kindergartner, okay? So I get it about the art. I get it about the suffering. Y'all hadn't talked much about God. And so my question is, in your suffering, because clearly it's been there, like for you, what was the doorway? How did you access this, I'm going to use my word, this miraculous source that maybe kept you going? Yes, maybe it was art, but this is theology in art, right? What about God? It's a 3-letter word, not necessarily a 4-letter word. You know, we can use that word, God.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. So I think we were just talking about like what's the appropriate bridging metaphor, right? So is art the vehicle that creates the bridge toward us and God? So that's sort of like much of the discussion has been around that middle place that brings us toward things that are not us, and that most of the insularity that could actually lead us for or against is not, the bridge isn't inherently good in and of itself. How do you?
Well, I have one kind of answer. I did nothing in the midst of suffering to access God. God accessed me in the midst of suffering. And I did nothing. And so I have, that is the only answer I have.
How did you know that?
How did I know it?
Yes, how did you know that God reached out and got you?
We have a debate. I have no clear answer for you there. Any more than I can say in any time in my life when I felt the presence of God. How did I know it? I just knew it. I just everything, all of my intuitions knew it. And I trust, I'm an artist. I trust my intuitions more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say the same. You just know. I mean, just thinking, through people in my life, through the ability, the creative capability itself to me is a gift that I believe. And love is something that since I was a little kid, I was formed and shaped to see at work in the world, in the midst of, I was just never immune to the harsh realities that exist in this world and the way love can be present with us, how God, if you want to use God, can be present with us in the midst of that and compel us and move us and even help us stay and remain still and weep and cry in silence. I mean, and I say that because even, and maybe that's all I need to say. The night that AJ died, I was in the hospital room by myself. And I just remember wailing out. And it was that kind of David that we hear about in the Psalms, like that David was probably cussing a lot, right? So those 4-letter words did come out. And it wrapped up with this naming of the need, and this is just my own personal, I was like, I need to see love, and I need to see it intangible, can hold me, feel me, walk with me kind of ways, right? And then in saying that, I even said, and I will look for it, I will expect it, I will see it, and and so we bring all of our story into these moments, and then they work themselves, like when I come to the canvas, it's all there and with me. In ways that are abstract at times.
But it's not as if theology is not part of this. I mean, I just think it's very much like the writing of poetry. I think a moment of faith happens to you and it's completely inexplicable. And then you may spend the rest of your life trying to explain it. But you can't, ultimately. And all of religion is an attempt to explain that moment of volatility when you were seized. And I was very helped by Jürgen Moltmann. He helped me understand what that suffering might be leading me to. I was very helped by a minister friend of mine who talked with me all the time. So there was very palpable, direct things that helped me. But the moment itself, I don't know.
My strongest feeling of it sometimes was, and some of the people who were part of it are in this room, but that so many people at Duke Divinity School came over to pray with me and over me. Just like the feeling of their hands on my head, just reconstituting me when I wasn't sure what it meant to be me anymore. And seems like every single person apparently has anointing oil just like in their back pocket, ready to go.
Very particular.
Yeah. I had like an acne-shaped cross on my forehead at one point. So I think we have time maybe for one more question.
Yeah, Chris, when I discovered Poetry Magazine years ago, you were the editor, and I was discovering, I think, my own calling as a poet. And whenever you'd publish Richard Wilbur or something, I would be like, formal poetry, awesome. And in graduate school, my wife and I lost our first child, and I didn't know what to do. And I was going through the library in Edinburgh, and I found Korean poetry from the medieval era, and the form of sijo was something I grabbed onto and kind of worked through grief while writing. As editor of Poetry Magazine, what did you see as the most fruitful engagements with traditional forms going on in America? I know it's weird to talk about formal traditions and grief, but I feel like, in Dante and Gerard Manley Hopkins, in some of these medieval Korean poems, the form and the expression of holding on to at least something solid in a world that's slipping away seems so inextricably linked. Where is that going on in poetry in English today, from your view as an editor?
Gosh, I think there are a lot of formal poets. I'm much more inclined to think in terms of poems than poets. I will often love one poem by a poet. So if you ask me, do you like that poet's work? Well, really, no. But I like that poem. But there's a wonderful poem by Carol Ann Duffy called Prayer. Did anybody know that poem? Some days, although we cannot pray, a prayer utters itself. Yes. You know that? So a woman will lift her head from the sieve of her hands to stare at the minim sung by a tree, a sudden gift. Some nights, although we are faithless, the truth enters our hearts, that small, familiar pain. Then a man will stand stock still, hearing his youth in the distant Latin chanting of a train. Pray for us now. Grade 1 piano scales console the lodger as he looks out across a Midlands town. Then dusk, and someone calls a child's name as though they named their loss. Darkness outside. Inside, the radio's prayer. Rockall, Malin, Dogger, Finisterre. Those are shipping names, the names of the shipping forecast on the radio. And the prayers seeming to come through the radio. Rockall, Malin, Dogger, Finisterre. Perfectly metrical, formal sonnet. A classical sonnet written by a living poet. I think it's everywhere.
Before we hand things over to our fair dean, I just want to say how grateful I am that you've entered into this with honesty and vulnerability and community. And as co-grievers, I'm grateful to have your friendship. Thank you so much for being so honest.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Kate.
We have been privileged this evening to be able to watch through a window pane the beauty of the intersections of suffering and art and God. Would you join me in thanking once again Kate and Chris and Lanecia?